The deadly miscalculation at Gela. When German armor met American industrial might on the 11th day of July in 1943, Field Marshal Kesselring felt absolutely confident that he had trapped the American forces in precisely the position he desired. From his perspective, the situation appeared ideal for a German victory. The American infantry found themselves pinned down along the beaches at Gela, their backs literally against the Mediterranean Sea, with nowhere to retreat. Kesselring possessed what every commander dreams of, the crucial element of surprise. But even more significantly, he had at his disposal the Hermann Göring Division, which was already maneuvering into their attack positions. Leading this formidable force were the Tiger tanks, which had earned their reputation as the most terrifying and devastating weapon system that World War II had yet produced. When you examined the situation through the lens of 2 decades' worth of established military doctrine and tactical theory, the American invasion force appeared to be facing certain doom. This wasn't just optimistic thinking on Kesselring's part. It was based on fundamental military principles that had been proven time and again throughout history. Every military professional understood one basic truth: no infantry force anywhere in the world, regardless of how well trained or determined, could hope to withstand a concentrated panzer assault without having heavy artillery positioned to support them. The mathematics of warfare seemed crystal clear in this scenario. Field Marshal Kesselring was already mentally composing the victory report he would transmit to Berlin. In his mind, he could see the timeline clearly. His forces would drive the Allied troops back into the ocean waves before the clock struck noon. The day would end with a decisive German victory, and the Allied invasion of Sicily would be recorded in history as a catastrophic failure. However, what Kesselring couldn't possibly know was that he was making a calculation error that would prove absolutely fatal to his plans and to many of his men. You see, Kesselring was operating under the assumption that he was engaging with a conventional military force, an army that would fight according to the established rules and limitations that he understood so well. What he failed to realize, what he couldn't have known from his headquarters hundreds of kilometers away, was that he wasn't facing a traditional army at all. Instead, he was about to encounter an entirely revolutionary form of warfare that would rewrite the tactical handbook. Within just a few hours, he would witness the destruction of his elite division, and the devastating blow wouldn't come from enemy tanks rolling across the Sicilian terrain. It wouldn't come from Allied aircraft screaming down from the sky. Instead, it would come from a force that, according to everything Kesselring understood about warfare, shouldn't have been capable of reaching his armored columns at all. Let me tell you more about Field Marshal Albert Kesselring himself, because understanding the man helps us understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold. During that summer of 1943, Kesselring was 57 years old, a mature commander at the height of his capabilities. He wasn't some inexperienced officer promoted beyond his abilities. Quite the contrary. Kesselring was a veteran who had survived the brutal trenches and gas attacks of the First World War, and he had spent the decades since then rising steadily through the ranks. He had become one of the most experienced and genuinely respected commanders in the entire Wehrmacht. His colleagues and even his enemies acknowledged his tactical acumen and strategic thinking. Kesselring's career path had taken him through the Luftwaffe, where he had commanded entire air fleets during the Battle of Britain back in 1940. If you remember your history, that was the massive aerial campaign where Germany attempted to bomb Britain into submission before launching an invasion. Kesselring had been one of the key architects of that campaign. Later, he had orchestrated the devastating and relentless aerial bombardment of Malta, that tiny but strategically crucial island in the Mediterranean. His air campaign had nearly succeeded in starving the island's defenders into surrender, cutting off their supply lines and pounding their defenses day after day. Beyond these specific operations, Kesselring had been responsible for coordinating Axis military operations across the entire Mediterranean theater of war. This was an enormous area of responsibility, stretching from North Africa to Italy, from the Greek islands to the Atlantic approaches. He had dealt with complex logistics, managed competing interests between German and Italian forces, and kept multiple campaigns running simultaneously. But here's what's particularly important for understanding what was about to happen at Gela. Kesselring wasn't just a tactician who understood how to maneuver troops on a battlefield. He fundamentally understood logistics, the unglamorous but absolutely critical science of moving supplies, equipment, and men across vast distances. He grasped the importance of industrial capacity and how it translated into military power. He knew, perhaps better than most commanders of his era, what it actually took to move thousands of men and thousands of tons of material across hundreds of kilometers, and then concentrate that force at the exact decisive point where it could achieve maximum impact. These concepts weren't abstract theories to Kesselring. They weren't classroom exercises or hypothetical scenarios from a military academy textbook. Instead, they formed the very foundation of modern warfare as he had studied it, practiced it, and perfected it over 3 full decades of military service. He had seen these principles proven in combat from the trenches of World War I through the lightning campaigns of World War II. And yet, despite all this experience, despite all this knowledge, despite his proven track record of success, what Kesselring was observing unfold across the island of Sicily on the 10th and 11th of July, 1943, seemed to completely exceed and contradict everything he thought he understood about military possibility. The scale of what he was seeing challenged his fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. His intelligence network, which had been carefully tracking Allied convoy movements, had monitored the massive fleet crossing the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa toward Sicily. The intelligence reports that kept arriving at his headquarters at Frascati, a location nestled in the hills to the southeast of Rome, contained numbers that initially seemed like they had to be mistakes. Kesselring's first reaction, shared by many of his staff officers, was that surely someone in the intelligence section had made an error while compiling the data. Perhaps they had added an extra 0 to the figures. Perhaps the reconnaissance aircraft had counted the same ships multiple times, inflating the numbers. These seemed like the only rational explanations for the figures they were seeing. But the numbers weren't errors. The Allied invasion fleet consisted of 3,200 ships. Not 300 vessels, which would have already been an enormous fleet. Not 320, 3,200 individual vessels of every conceivable type. They were battleships with their massive main guns capable of hurling shells the weight of automobiles over distances of dozens of kilometers. They were cruisers designed specifically for fleet action and shore bombardment, their gun batteries positioned to rain destruction on coastal targets. They were destroyers meant to screen the larger ships and hunt enemy submarines prowling beneath the waves. They were specialized troop transport ships designed to carry thousands of soldiers across the open ocean in relative safety and comfort. There were tank landing ships with their distinctive bow doors that could open like massive jaws to disgorge armor directly onto beaches. There were cargo vessels stuffed with supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, medical equipment, and spare parts. There were hospital ships painted white with prominent red crosses, ready to receive the wounded and provide surgical care. The largest amphibious fleet ever assembled in the entire history of human warfare was converging on Sicily, and the ships were just part of the equation. 4,000 aircraft were providing air cover and support for this invasion. Again, not 400 planes, which would have represented a massive air armada by the standards of just a few years earlier. 4,000 fighters, bombers, and transport planes were ready to dominate the skies over Sicily, to strafe enemy positions, to bomb German strongpoints, to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines, and to ensure that the Luftwaffe couldn't interfere with the landing operations. Then there were the troops themselves. 180,000 soldiers were prepared to land in just the first wave of the invasion. These weren't garrison troops or poorly trained conscripts scraped together from training depots. These were soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. Professional military forces that had been training intensively for months, specifically for this operation. They came equipped with tanks that could match German armor in battle. They brought artillery pieces that could provide devastating fire support. They had trucks to ensure mobility once they broke out from the beaches and began advancing inland. They carried enough ammunition to sustain combat operations for weeks, without requiring resupply from the beachhead. This was a fully modern, mechanized military force being delivered directly onto enemy-held territory. In his 25 years of military service, through 2 world wars and numerous smaller conflicts, Kesselring had never witnessed anything even approaching this scale of military operation. To put it in perspective that really drives home the magnitude, consider this: the German invasion of France back in 1940, the campaign that had conquered Western Europe in just 6 weeks, that had shocked the world with its speed and efficiency, that had seemed like the pinnacle of military power and the ultimate demonstration of German tactical superiority, had actually employed fewer overall resources than what the Allies were now bringing to Sicily. That comparison alone should have told Kesselring something profound about the nature of the enemy he was facing and the industrial capacity they could bring to bear. The invasion had commenced during the night hours of July 9th, 1943. American and British paratroopers had dropped across southeastern Sicily under the protective cover of darkness. The plan had called for these airborne troops to seize key bridges, road junctions, and high ground before the seaborne forces hit the beaches at dawn. However, the airborne operation hadn't gone smoothly at all. High winds, those unpredictable Mediterranean weather patterns that had plagued sailors and aviators for millennia, had scattered the paratroopers over hundreds of square kilometers of Sicilian territory. Some of these paratroopers, weighed down by their equipment, weapons, and parachutes, had landed in the Mediterranean Sea and drowned before they could free themselves from their harnesses and swim to shore. The weight of their gear pulled them down into the dark water, and many never resurfaced. Other troopers had come down kilometers away from their intended drop zones, landing in completely wrong locations where their carefully memorized maps and reconnaissance photos were essentially useless. They found themselves in unfamiliar terrain, with no idea how to reach their objectives. Some entire units had landed so far off target that they spent the first crucial hours of the invasion not fighting the enemy, but simply trying to locate each other. to form cohesive groups that could function as military units, to figure out where they actually were in relation to where they were supposed to be. As a cohesive, organized fighting force, the airborne troops were temporarily scattered, confused, and unable to execute their assigned missions effectively. Kesselring's staff officers had noted this development with considerable satisfaction when the reports came in during the early morning hours. To them, this chaos suggested that Allied planning had failed its first critical test. The airborne operation, which was supposed to be the cutting edge of modern military capability, the elite vanguard that would pave the way for the beach landings, had apparently dissolved into disorder before the main invasion even began. This seemed to confirm German assumptions about American military competence. Kesselring saw his opportunity with crystal clarity. He understood, as every military commander throughout history has understood, the fundamental vulnerability of any amphibious operation. That vulnerability occurs during the first 24 hours, that crucial period before heavy weapons can be unloaded from ships and positioned ashore, before defensive positions can be properly established and fortified with barbed wire and minefields, before the beachhead can be secured against determined counterattacks by armor and infantry. This wasn't some obscure tactical theory known only to specialists. Every military theorist who had ever studied amphibious warfare understood this basic principle. Every commander who had ever planned coastal defense operations had planned to exploit exactly this vulnerability. It was Warfare 101. The logic was straightforward and had been proven time and again. If German armored forces could strike the American beachheads before the Americans managed to consolidate their positions and organize their defense properly, the entire invasion could be shattered. The German tanks could split the invasion force into separate, isolated pockets that couldn't support each other. They could drive wedges between the different landing beaches, preventing the Allied units from linking up and creating a continuous defensive line. Most crucially, they could push the invaders back into the water before the Americans could bring their overwhelming material superiority fully to bear on the battlefield. Speed was everything in this scenario. Kesselring had actually seen this exact scenario play out successfully before, which gave him confidence in his battle plan. At Dieppe, on the French coast, in August of 1942, a combined British and Canadian raid had been utterly annihilated on the beaches in less than 10 hours of brutal combat. The attackers had been caught between German defenses on the land and the open water behind them, with no escape route and no way to bring in reinforcements once the initial landing craft had withdrawn back to England. It had been a devastating defeat for the Allies, with casualties exceeding 50% of the raiding force, and it had confirmed what military theory predicted about the vulnerability of amphibious operations. Kesselring had studied the Dieppe raid carefully and drew lessons from it. The water behind an invasion force becomes its worst enemy in such situations. It allows absolutely no possibility of retreat. Troops can't fall back across dozens of kilometers of open ocean to regroup and reorganize. It offers no cover from enemy fire. There's nowhere to hide on a beach with enemy guns targeting you from elevated positions inland. It provides no route for reinforcements once the landing craft have departed to pick up the next wave of troops from the transport ships. With enough military pressure applied quickly enough and forcefully enough, troops who find themselves trapped between attacking tanks and the open sea will panic. Their unit cohesion will disintegrate, and the invasion will collapse into a rout. Men will throw down their weapons and try to swim to the ships. Others will surrender en masse. The carefully planned invasion will turn into a slaughter. This was sound military doctrine, proven by historical example from ancient times through modern warfare. This was precisely how counterattacks against amphibious landings were supposed to work. According to decades of military theory and practice taught at every staff college. Based on all this understanding, drawing on his decades of experience, Kesselring gave the order that would seal the fate of thousands of men. The Hermann Göring Division would attack at dawn. Now, the Hermann Göring Division represented everything that German military doctrine had refined and perfected over 4 years of increasingly brutal warfare across multiple continents. The division had originally been created from Luftwaffe ground personnel, airmen who had been retrained as ground combat troops, and it had been named for the Reich Marshal himself, Hermann Göring, who commanded the German Air Force and was one of Hitler's closest associates. During 1942 and early 1943, the division had been completely rebuilt, reorganized, and retrained into a first-rate panzer formation that could stand alongside the Wehrmacht's best armored divisions, like the famous Panzer Lehr Division. The soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division were fanatically loyal to the Nazi regime. They had been carefully selected not just for their physical capabilities, but for their ideological commitment. They had been indoctrinated with National Socialist ideology and believed deeply in the cause they were fighting for. The division's officers were combat-tested veterans who had survived the absolutely brutal fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, fighting that had been far more savage, more pitiless, and more unforgiving than anything seen in Western Europe or North Africa. If you could survive combat on the Eastern Front, where battles routinely involved hundreds of thousands of men and lasted for months, you could handle anything. The division's training program emphasized aggressive, offensive action and tactical flexibility, the ability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions and to exploit any weakness in enemy formations. German doctrine had always stressed the importance of initiative, of seizing opportunities, of maintaining momentum in attack. The Hermann Göring Division had absorbed these lessons thoroughly, but most importantly, at least for what was about to happen on the beaches of Gela, the Hermann Göring Division's equipment included the Tiger tank. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger, to give it its full formal German designation, was the most feared armored vehicle anywhere in the world during 1943. Its reputation wasn't based on propaganda or exaggeration for newsreels. The Tiger was genuinely terrifying for anyone who had to face it on the battlefield. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick, a massive sheet of hardened steel that no Allied tank gun of that period could penetrate at normal combat ranges. Allied tank crews had learned through bitter, costly experience that shooting at the front of a Tiger tank was essentially useless and just revealed your position to the enemy. The shells would simply bounce off or shatter against that thick armor plate, doing no damage whatsoever except perhaps scratching the paint. Meanwhile, the Tiger's own main gun, an 88mm cannon derived from the legendary Flak 88 anti-aircraft weapon that Germany had been using since the Spanish Civil War, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. The Tiger could kill you from distances where you couldn't even effectively shoot back. The tactical implications were devastating. In the hands of experienced, well-trained crews who understood how to use the Tiger's advantages, a single Tiger tank could hold an entire road against advancing enemy columns, destroying vehicle after vehicle as they tried to push forward. There are documented cases of individual Tiger tanks accounting for dozens of enemy vehicles in single engagements. The psychological impact of the Tiger was almost as important as its actual combat capabilities. Allied tank crews had developed what amounted to Tiger fear, a dread of encountering these nearly invulnerable killing machines. Some crews would refuse to advance if they knew Tigers were in the area. 17 Tigers were leading the assault toward Gela on the morning of July 11th. This might not sound like many tanks, but each Tiger was worth multiple conventional tanks in combat effectiveness. Behind these heavy tanks rolled the division's Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, less heavily armored than the Tigers, but still formidable fighting vehicles with good guns and proven reliability. Infantry soldiers and support troops rode in armored Amphibious 251 half-tracks, which could keep pace with the tanks and provide protected transport for the men who would need to clear enemy positions and secure objectives. The total attack force numbered over 4,000 men, with more than 200 vehicles of various types: tanks, half-tracks, trucks, artillery tractors, command vehicles. Artillery batteries were preparing to provide fire support, ready to pound American positions once targets were identified and coordinates radioed back. The division's reconnaissance units had already scouted the terrain during the previous day and night, identified the American positions, and mapped out the routes of advance that would allow the armor to move quickly toward the beaches. For Kesselring, receiving these reports at his headquarters, 500 kilometers, to the north in Frascati, far from the sounds of battle, this represented exactly the scenario he had been planning for. His tactical concept was elegantly simple, as the best military plans always are. Strike hard, strike fast, and exploit the chaos of the landing before the Americans could properly organize their defense and bring their superior numbers and equipment to bear. The Hermann Göring Division had everything it needed: the firepower to overwhelm American positions, the training to execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions, and the determination and ideological motivation to throw the invasion back into the sea. On paper, analyzing the situation from headquarters, the plan was nearly perfect. Victory seemed assured. At 6:15 in the morning, as the sun was rising over Sicily and promising another hot July day, the German columns began moving south across the Gela Plain toward the invasion beaches. Every factor seemed to favor the attackers. The terrain itself worked to their advantage. The Gela Plain was flat agricultural land, perfect for armored operations. Tanks could move quickly across this ground without the complications of hills, forests, or urban terrain that would slow them down and break up their formations. The roads, though they were dusty from the July heat and hadn't been maintained to military standards during the war years, were still adequate for military vehicles. Tank tracks and truck tires could handle the surface without bogging down. The distance from the German assembly areas to the American perimeter was less than 15 kilometers. At standard advance rates, assuming minimal resistance from scattered American units, the Tigers would be among the American positions within 2 hours. By mid-morning, the battle would be decided one way or another. The Americans would either be throwing down their weapons and surrendering, or they'd be desperately trying to evacuate back to their ships, abandoning equipment on the beaches. German reconnaissance units continued to send back encouraging reports as the columns advanced. The resistance ahead appeared weak and disorganized. The American 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One that had fought in North Africa, had managed to get ashore and establish a foothold, but they had landed with minimal armor support. Most of their tanks were still aboard transport ships waiting to be unloaded. a process that required specialized landing craft and took many hours of careful work. The Americans' artillery batteries were being assembled on the beaches, with crews working frantically to get the guns positioned and ready, but they weren't yet operational and ready to fire in support of the infantry. The defensive perimeter that the Americans had established extended only 3 kilometers inland from the waterline, a shallow foothold that could be easily overrun by determined armor attack. Darby's Rangers, an elite American unit known for tough fighting, and various infantry companies had occupied the town of Gela itself, establishing defensive positions in the buildings. But intelligence reports indicated they possessed no weapons capable of stopping Tiger tanks at long range. The 37mm anti-tank guns that American infantry units carried as standard equipment were nearly useless against heavy German armor. Everyone on both sides knew this. At best, they might damage a tank's tracks or injure crew members looking out of open hatches, but they couldn't penetrate the Tiger's armor. You might as well throw rocks at the Tigers for all the good those small anti-tank guns would do. The conditions for a successful counterattack seemed nearly perfect, perhaps as close to ideal as a military commander could hope for in the chaos of real warfare. Kesselring permitted himself cautious optimism as the morning reports continued to arrive at his headquarters. The staff officers were already preparing the victory communique that would be sent to Berlin. This would be a significant success, a demonstration that the Wehrmacht could still throw Allied invasions back into the sea. But here's what Kesselring could not see from his command post in Frascati, 500 kilometers away from the action. Here's what his intelligence had failed to adequately assess and understand, despite all their reconnaissance flights and agent reports. Here's the factor that would completely change the equation of this battle. The Americans had not simply landed troops on the beaches of Sicily. They hadn't just dropped paratroopers and rushed infantry ashore to establish a basic foothold that would need to be expanded slowly. They had positioned just offshore, barely visible from the beaches, a floating artillery platform unlike anything that had ever existed in military history. The Western Naval Task Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt, an experienced naval officer who understood the complexities of amphibious operations, had formed a steel crescent around the invasion beaches. Cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, dozens of warships carrying enough firepower to devastate any ground force that came within 30 kilometers of the coast. Let me give you some names so you understand the scale and the specific ships involved. USS Savannah, USS Boise, USS Birmingham, USS Brooklyn, USS Philadelphia. These weren't merely escort vessels whose job was to protect the transport ships from enemy submarines or surface raiders. These weren't just there to provide anti-aircraft defense against the Luftwaffe. These were floating gun batteries, mobile artillery platforms capable of delivering sustained bombardment at industrial scale. Consider what just a single Brooklyn-class light cruiser like USS Boise could do when properly employed against ground targets. She carried 15 6-inch guns, that's 152 millimeters in metric measurements, arranged in 5 triple turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft. Each individual gun could fire 8 rounds per minute when the crew was working at combat tempo, which they had trained for extensively. Do the mathematics. The ship could put over 100 high-explosive shells onto a target area in just 60 seconds of sustained fire. That's more firepower than an entire battalion of field artillery could deliver. And this wasn't a brief burst of fire that would exhaust the ship's ammunition supply and leave it defenseless. Her magazines, deep in the armored hull below the waterline, held enough ammunition for days of continuous combat operations. The ship could keep firing hour after hour, as long as targets presented themselves and the guns didn't overheat. USS Boise's fire control systems represented the cutting edge of naval technology for that era. They used radar systems to detect targets beyond visual range, penetrating darkness and haze. They used mechanical computers, complex analog calculating machines with gears and cams, to solve the mathematical problems of trajectory, wind drift, target motion, and the Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. These weren't simple calculations. Getting a shell to land accurately 20 kilometers away required solving differential equations that would take a human calculator with pencil and paper many minutes to work out. The mechanical computers could do it in seconds, even beyond visual range. Even when the ship's crew couldn't actually see their target with their own eyes, USS Boise could hit targets at 20 kilometers with devastating precision. This wasn't random harassment, fire meant to make the enemy keep their heads down. This was accurate, directed bombardment that could walk shells onto specific buildings, specific road intersections, specific concentrations of enemy forces. And the cruisers weren't alone in this capability. The destroyers that surrounded the invasion beaches carried 127mm guns, 5-inch guns in the American designation system, smaller than the cruiser batteries, certainly, but faster firing and present in large numbers. Dozens of destroyers were positioned to provide fire support, their crews eager to engage enemy targets. Together, working in coordination with the cruisers, sharing targeting information over radio links, they could blanket square kilometers of terrain with explosive steel. The Hermann Goering Division was advancing directly into a kill zone that extended far beyond anything its commanders had anticipated or prepared for in their planning. They were walking into a trap they couldn't even see, couldn't detect, had no way of knowing existed until the first shells started falling. At 8:30 in the morning, German forward units made their first contact with American defensive positions on the outskirts of Gela. The Tiger tanks engaged exactly as their training and doctrine prescribed, using their superior range and armor to destroy enemy positions from distances where the Americans couldn't effectively shoot back. Their 88mm guns began systematically destroying American foxholes and machine gun positions, firing high-explosive shells that burst among the defenders. American infantry fell back toward the beaches, unable to stop the German advance, calling frantically for support over their radios. Anti-tank rounds fired from American positions bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's frontal armor, creating showers of sparks but not penetrating the thick steel plates. The German tank commanders felt invincible, unstoppable. For 90 minutes, the counterattack appeared to be succeeding perfectly according to plan. German armor advanced steadily, crushing resistance, pushing deeper toward the beaches with each passing minute. American resistance weakened as units fell back or were destroyed in their positions. The beach itself seemed within reach. Officers could see the landing craft through their binoculars. The invasion appeared to be on the verge of collapse, exactly as Kesselring had predicted. Victory seemed imminent. Some German soldiers were already thinking about rest and resupply after the battle was won. Then the naval guns opened fire, and everything changed in an instant. At 9:10 in the morning, USS Boise received precise targeting coordinates from shore fire control parties, teams of specially trained naval gunfire liaison officers who had gone ashore with the American infantry and had been radioing back exact locations of the German advance throughout the morning. These officers were equipped with radios, maps, and the training to translate ground observations into coordinates that ships could use. Now that information was being put to devastating use. The ship's 15 6-inch guns trained inland, rotating in their turrets and elevating to the proper angle. Range was calculated by the mechanical fire control computers, taking into account wind speed, air temperature, the ship's motion in the waves. Elevation was adjusted to the precise degree. The powder charges were loaded into the breeches, the shells were rammed home. The order to fire was given. The first salvo launched with a sound that rolled across the Mediterranean Sea like thunder, a deep earth-shaking roar that could be heard for kilometers in every direction. The concussion from 15 guns firing simultaneously rattled windows in Gela and made the ship shudder in the water. The shells, each weighing as much as a grown man, arced through the clear morning sky in parabolic trajectories. 43 seconds later, after traveling more than 20 kilometers, they landed among the advancing German columns. For the tank commanders of the Hermann Göring Division, men who had survived brutal combat on the Eastern Front where they'd faced Soviet artillery and massed tank attacks, men who thought they had experienced every horror that modern warfare could produce. This experience was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. High-explosive shells, each weighing 47 kilograms, began falling from what appeared to be a clear, empty sky. There was no warning whatsoever. There was no sound of artillery firing from nearby positions that might have given them a few seconds to button up their tanks and take cover. There was no muzzle flash they could spot and report. There was simply the sudden, devastating impact of naval ordnance that had been originally designed to penetrate battleship armor and was now being used against ground targets. The explosions were enormous, throwing up fountains of dirt and shrapnel. The German crews quickly realized the hopelessness of their situation. There was no possibility of counter-battery fire. Their artillery couldn't reach ships positioned 20 kilometers offshore. Artillery pieces designed for ground warfare simply didn't have that range. There was no air support available. The Luftwaffe had been swept from Sicilian skies by overwhelming Allied air superiority. German pilots who tried to fly combat missions were being shot down as soon as they appeared. There was no way to engage an enemy that remained invisible beyond the horizon, completely immune to any weapon the division possessed. They were being systematically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't reach, and couldn't fight back against. It was like being beaten by an invisible opponent. Kesselring's headquarters received the first confused reports around 9:30 in the morning. The counterattack had stalled. Casualties were mounting rapidly, with multiple vehicles destroyed and entire platoons wiped out. The source of the devastating fire was initially unclear. Officers on the scene didn't immediately understand what was happening. Some reports mentioned aircraft, thinking perhaps Allied bombers were making precision strikes. Others mentioned artillery of impossible caliber, assuming some new weapon system had been deployed. The truth was worse than any of those explanations. On the Gela plain, the reality unfolding was catastrophic for the attackers. USS Savannah joined the bombardment at 9:25 in the morning. Her 15 guns added another 100 rounds per minute to the steel rain falling on the German columns. Destroyers added their fire, their 5-inch guns pumping shells onto the target area. The American ships were not conducting harassing fire meant to slow the enemy down. They were not firing randomly at suspected enemy positions. They were conducting a systematic, methodical destruction of an armored division, working from carefully plotted coordinates and adjusting fire based on reports from shore observers. The German advance did not slow gradually. It stopped as if the entire division had driven into an invisible wall of exploding steel. Units simply ceased moving forward, taking whatever cover they could find. Tiger tanks that had been invulnerable to anything the American infantry could deploy, that had been crushing through defensive positions with impunity just minutes before, were now burning on the Gala plain, columns of black smoke rising into the morning sky. The naval shells did not need to penetrate their heavy armor directly, which would have been difficult even for these large-caliber weapons. Concentrated explosions destroyed tracks and road wheels, immobilizing vehicles that then became stationary targets for follow-up salvos. Fragments killed exposed commanders and crew members who were looking out of hatches trying to understand what was happening. Near misses detonated ammunition trucks and fuel vehicles, creating secondary explosions that spread the destruction. The concussion alone, from shells landing close to tanks, wounded men inside buttoned-up tanks, giving them traumatic brain injuries and ruptured eardrums. By 10 o'clock in the morning, just 50 minutes after the naval bombardment began, the Hermann Göring Division had lost 6 of its precious Tiger tanks. Not to American armor in tank-versus-tank combat, not to anti-tank guns firing at close range, but to ships they could not see and could not reach. Each Tiger lost represented a significant blow to German combat power. These tanks couldn't be easily replaced. They were expensive, complex machines that took months to build in factories that were already struggling to meet production quotas. For Kesselring, sitting in his headquarters receiving report after report throughout the morning, the dispatches arriving painted an incomprehensible tactical picture. His elite division was being destroyed by naval gunfire. Warships were annihilating a mobile armored formation that was conducting a fluid ground offensive. This was not how modern warfare was supposed to work, according to any doctrine he had studied. This was not how any warfare had ever worked throughout history. Ships bombarded fixed coastal fortifications during amphibious landings. Everyone understood that role. Ships provided covering fire while troops crossed beaches, suppressing enemy positions near the waterline. That was their traditional role going back centuries. But ships did not engage maneuvering panzer divisions in meeting engagements 15 kilometers inland. That was supposed to be impossible. The ranges involved exceeded what anyone thought naval guns could do against ground targets. The accuracy required to hit moving columns seemed impossible without forward observers, and Kesselring didn't fully understand how effective the American coordination between ground and naval forces had become. The ammunition expenditure necessary to suppress an entire armored formation, thousands and thousands of shells, seemed economically unsustainable. None of it fit within conventional military doctrine as taught in staff colleges and war academies. But the Americans were not fighting according to conventional doctrine. They were writing a new doctrine through practical experience. Between 9:10 and 11 o'clock in the morning, just under 2 hours of sustained fire, the Naval Task Force fired over 3,766 shells at targets on the Gala Plain. Think about that number for a moment. 3,766 individual shells, each weighing between 40 and 70 kilograms, each packed with high explosives. That single morning's bombardment exceeded the artillery support most German divisions received in an entire month of combat on the Eastern Front, where they were facing the full might of Soviet artillery. And the ships could maintain this rate of fire indefinitely. They weren't running low on ammunition. Ammunition ships waited offshore with tens of thousands of additional rounds, ready to be transferred to the warships. The industrial capacity of American shipyards and munitions factories had created not just a navy, but a mobile artillery system of continental scale that could be deployed anywhere within range of salt water. The Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the English Channel, anywhere ships could sail, this devastating firepower could reach. The commander of the Hermann Göring Division, recognizing that his attack had failed catastrophically, ordered a tactical withdrawal at 1100 hours. His counterattack had not simply failed to achieve its objectives. It had been annihilated in less than 4 hours of combat. 10 of his 17 irreplaceable Tiger tanks were destroyed, disabled, or abandoned on the battlefield. Hundreds of his soldiers lay dead and wounded across the Gela Plain, scattered among burning vehicles and shell craters. His remaining forces retreated into the hills northwest of the beaches, moving beyond the effective range of the naval guns where they might regroup. But the damage was done. The division's offensive capability had been broken. The American beachhead at Gela was secure. The counterattack that should have thrown the invasion into the sea, that should have validated German defensive doctrine and given the Wehrmacht a significant victory, had been crushed by floating firepower from beyond the horizon. The age of the battleship might have been ending, but the age of naval gunfire support was just beginning. Kesselring understood what had happened at Gela with terrible strategic clarity. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of amphibious warfare that had plagued military planners since ancient times. Landing forces were 14. 52, always vulnerable in the critical first hours before heavy weapons could be brought ashore and organized for defense. Every military academy taught this principle. Every commander since ancient times had planned to exploit this vulnerability. Catch them on the beaches before they can organize. Strike the enemy while he is half landed, half organized, half prepared. It was basic military doctrine. But the Americans had eliminated the vulnerability entirely by making their ships into mobile artillery that could reach far inland. A cruiser offshore could deliver more firepower than an entire Army artillery regiment, composed of dozens of guns and hundreds of men. It could do so within minutes of receiving targeting coordinates, with no need to move guns forward or establish firing positions. It could continue firing for hours without resupply concerns, drawing on massive ammunition reserves in its magazines. It could reposition faster than any ground-based battery, simply by steaming to a new location. And unlike artillery positioned on land, it could not be captured by enemy ground forces. It could not be overrun by infantry or tanks. It could not be flanked by mobile forces, and it could not be destroyed by a ground counterattack. The ships were immune to everything the German army could throw at them. This was not merely a tactical innovation, a clever new technique that might provide temporary advantage. It was an industrial revolution applied to warfare. Building Brooklyn-class cruisers required shipyard capacity that Germany simply did not possess and could not develop. The specialized facilities, the trained workers, the complex supply chains for armor plate and turbines and gun barrels. Germany couldn't match it. Manning these ships with trained crews required naval academies and years of development to build the expertise needed to operate such complex vessels effectively. Supplying them with ammunition required manufacturing output at scales the Axis powers could never match. American factories were producing shells by the millions, while German factories struggled to keep up with basic needs. The shells falling on the Hermann Göring Division represented not just firepower, but an entire economic and industrial system mobilized for total war. Every shell contained steel from American mills, explosives from American chemical plants, fuses from American precision manufacturing facilities. The ships that fired them had been built in American shipyards by American workers using American resources. The sailors who crewed them had been trained in American naval schools. Behind every aspect of this bombardment stood the full productive capacity of the American economy, an economy that had been converting to war production since 1941 and was now reaching peak output. Kesselring had lost more than 10 Tiger tanks on the Gela Plain. He had lost the strategic initiative in Sicily. The campaign would continue, but the outcome was now predetermined. The campaign for Sicily continued for another 38 days after the failed counterattack at Gela. But its fundamental outcome was decided on the morning of July 11th. Without the ability to mount successful counterattacks against the beachheads, without the capability to drive the Allies back into the sea during that critical first day, Kesselring could only conduct a fighting withdrawal toward the northeastern corner of the island. Every German military manual emphasized the importance of offensive action, of seizing and maintaining the initiative. Now that initiative was gone, never to be recovered. The Hermann Göring Division never recovered its offensive capability during the Sicily campaign. Its remaining Tigers, those precious few that had survived the naval bombardment, were fed into defensive battles piecemeal, rather than being concentrated for decisive action as doctrine prescribed. You take your best equipment and you concentrate it at the decisive point. That's basic military theory. But Kesselring no longer had the luxury of choosing decisive points. He was reacting to Allied moves, plugging gaps in his defensive line, trying to delay the inevitable. American and British forces advanced steadily across Sicily throughout July and early August. Their flanks remained protected by naval guns that could reach 30 kilometers inland, creating a protective umbrella that moved with the advancing troops. Any German force that massed for counterattack became a target for the floating artillery. Forward observers with radios would call in the coordinates, and within minutes, shells would be falling. Any position that seemed defensible, any ridgeline or river crossing that might slow the Allied advance, became untenable under naval bombardment. The ships could pound defensive positions for hours until they were nothing but cratered moonscapes where nothing could survive. Palermo, the Sicilian capital on the northern coast, fell on July 22nd. Catania, the major city on the eastern coast, fell on August 5th. Messina, at the island's northeastern tip, just 3 kilometers from the Italian mainland across the narrow strait, fell on August 17th. The Germans were running out of Sicily, being pushed into a smaller and smaller area. Kesselring managed one final achievement during the Sicilian disaster, one operation that demonstrated his considerable skill despite the inevitable defeat. Operation Lehrgang, the evacuation across the Strait of Messina, successfully withdrew over 100,000 German and Italian troops to the Italian mainland between August 11th and August 17th, using ferries, barges, rafts, and small craft of every description, operating under constant Allied air attack with fighters strafing anything that moved on the water. Kesselring's forces escaped to fight another day. It was a masterpiece of military withdrawal, executed with precision despite overwhelming enemy superiority. He saved his army from capture or annihilation, but he could not save Sicily. And more importantly, he could not change the fundamental equation that Gela had revealed about the nature of the war Germany was fighting. The balance of forces was simply too unequal. The lessons of Gela would repeat across the Mediterranean and eventually across the English Channel, demonstrating that what happened in Sicily was not a fluke or a one-time tactical surprise. At Salerno in September of 1943, when the Allies invaded mainland Italy, German counterattacks against the Allied landings again met devastating naval bombardment. Panzer divisions that tried to push the beachhead into the sea were shattered by cruiser and battleship fire before they could reach the American positions. The same pattern played out. Initial German success, then the naval guns opened up, then German withdrawal. At Anzio in January of 1944, where Allied forces established a beachhead south of Rome in an attempt to outflank German defensive lines, USS Brooklyn alone fired over 4,300 main battery rounds in a single month of combat support. That's one ship, 1 month, over 4,000 shells. The Germans tried repeatedly to eliminate the Anzio beachhead, throwing division after division into attacks that consumed men and equipment. But they could never overcome the naval gunfire that protected the Allied perimeter. At Normandy in June of 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history, naval gunfire would shatter German armored reserves before they could reach the invasion beaches. The 21st Panzer Division, attempting to counterattack on D-Day itself, encountered the same wall of naval steel that had destroyed the Hermann Göring Division a year earlier on Sicily. The result was the same: burning tanks, dead crews, a failed counterattack. The Germans never came close to throwing the Normandy invasion back into the sea, partly because they never could bring their armor to bear effectively against beachheads protected by battleships and cruisers. Kesselring spent the remainder of the war fighting defensive campaigns in Italy, demonstrating his considerable skill at defensive warfare. He built the Gustav Line across the Italian peninsula, a fortified defensive position that took advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain. He held Monte Cassino, a key position in the Gustav Line, for 5 months against repeated Allied assaults that cost thousands of casualties. The fighting at Monte Cassino was some of the most brutal of the entire war, with attacks and counterattacks over the same ground for months. He made the Americans and British pay for every kilometer of Italian soil in blood and time, extracting a terrible price for their advance. The Italian campaign became a grinding war of attrition that consumed Allied resources and delayed their advance toward Germany. But Kesselring never again attempted to throw an amphibious landing back into the sea. He had learned at Gela what American industrial power meant in practice, not in theory. He had seen what happened when German courage and tactical skill, which were both considerable and proven in countless battles, met American production capacity. The mathematics were impossible to overcome. You cannot win through bravery and tactical excellence when the enemy can deliver 10 times as many shells onto your positions, can replace losses 10 times faster than you can maintain 10 times the operational tempo because they have sufficient supplies, and you don't. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years after Sicily fell. Millions more soldiers and civilians would die in Europe and the Pacific. Cities would be reduced to rubble. The Nazi regime would fight to the bitter end, would throw children and old men into the line when the regular army was exhausted, would never surrender voluntarily. But for Kesselring, sitting in his headquarters watching reports come in about his elite Panzer Division being shattered by ships firing from beyond the horizon on July 11th, 1943, the ultimate outcome was already becoming clear to anyone with eyes to see. Germany was not fighting an army in the traditional sense. Germany was fighting a production system, an economic engine that had been converted to military purposes, a system that could build cruisers faster than Germany could build tanks, a system that could manufacture shells faster than Germany could train soldiers to use them, a system that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, making every German tactical victory strategically meaningless. And production systems, unlike armies, do not tire. They do not break under pressure. They do not lose their nerve after suffering casualties. They simply continue producing hour after hour, day after day, until the enemy has nothing left to fight with. The 17 Tiger tanks burning on the Gela plain, sending columns of black smoke into the Sicilian sky, were not just a tactical loss to be recorded in the day's casualty reports. They were a glimpse of Germany's future. They were a preview of what would happen to every German formation that tried to resist the Allied advance. The only question was how long the war would continue before Germany accepted the inevitable. Thank you for listening to this story from World War II. If you found this historical account compelling and educational, please consider supporting our work. We bring you the forgotten stories of World War II, the moments where individual courage met industrial reality, and the decisions that changed the course of history. These stories deserve to be remembered, to be told to new generations who didn't live through those terrible years. Where are you listening from today? What other stories from World War II would you like us to cover in future episodes? We're always looking for suggestions about battles, operations, and individuals whose stories deserve to be told. Your engagement and feedback help us continue bringing these important historical accounts to life, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. Until next time, remember that understanding history helps us understand ourselves and the world we live in today. The decisions made on that beach in Sicily in July of 1943 continue to echo through time, reminding us of the terrible power of industrial warfare and the courage of the individuals caught up in forces beyond their control.